All right, we are now at the beginning of the Revolutionary War. We're still in Chapter 5. We'll be in Chapter 5 until we have the test. And we're going to have a couple more lectures here, and we're going to send out my test tips and my advice to you on how to write your essay, how to format it, and all that sort of stuff. So definitely time to be keeping up, not falling behind. Remember, our test due date is October 9th, and you will have the essay questions at least a week before then. So we are moving pretty much in accordance with the course schedule. So when we got together last time out, we started the Revolutionary War at Lexington and Concord. We have seen the British driven back into Boston, where they've been laid under siege by New England militia, mostly from Massachusetts, although men from other states are coming in. We have seen the Second Continental Congress convene in Philadelphia in the Pennsylvania State House and find itself in the unexpected situation of having to run a war. Remember, the Second Continental Congress was not intended to be an American government. It was a meeting of the colonists that was going to check up on how those economic sanctions levied by the First Continental Congress and the Continental Association were working. Have they forced Britain to back down? Well, circumstances have changed. The Americans have begun a revolution, but remember, it's not a revolution designed to overthrow the established order. It's certainly not a revolution designed to overthrow the government in England. It's a revolution that is designed to try and turn the clock back, to take the colonies and their mother country to the moment when everything seemed good and right between them in the immediate aftermath of the French and Indian War. The colonies can pursue that because they are holding on tightly to a fiction, and that fiction is that their king, George III, does not know about everything that has been going on in America since 1763, or if he knows, he doesn't know the true story, the honest story, that his ministers, the people he appoints to run his government, have lied to him and deluded him, and that's why the petitions and the riots and the civil disobedience have not worked. That's why economic sanctions have not worked. And nothing seems to have gotten the attention of the king so that he would begin to investigate, realize how poorly his colonists have been treated by his government, and set things right, turn that clock back. And so the colonies have decided, somewhat spontaneously, really, not by deliberate plan, that perhaps military confrontation will attract the attention of the king. And surely, after April 19, 1775, and the fighting at Lexington and Concord, there's no way the king could ignore that his colonists are angry. He's got to ask that question, why are my colonists killing my troops? And when he asks that question, his ministers are not going to be able to fudge that answer. They're not going to be able to obfuscate here. The king's going to get the sense that something is wrong, and he's going to look into it, and being a good king with the interest of his people at heart, he will set things right. Of course, we know what the colonists don't know, and that's that nobody's been lying to George III at all. He hasn't been fooled. He's fully determined to keep the American colonies within the British Empire. He figures it out before the Americans themselves do, that this is really a question about whether these colonies are going to continue to be subservient to the crown or they're going to be independent. And so he is wholeheartedly in favor of breaking the will of the colonies. He was in favor of the course of acts, and now he's in favor of continuing war until Britain is in a position of strength from which it can dictate the terms of peace. In December of 1775, his parliament passed something called the Prohibitory Act, which for all intents and purposes declares war on American commerce. It orders the blockade of American ports. It prohibits Americans from trading with the rest of the world until the colonies have begged their forgiveness. And coming hard on the heels after that, his colonial secretary, Lord Dunsmore, urged slaves to take up arms against their masters in support of the British crown. That's a serious miscalculation on the part of the British, because if they had hoped that the New England colonies would sort of be isolated and causing all this trouble on their own, and after all, this is where it started, there's no absolute guarantee that the middle and especially the southern colonies are going to jump on board. In many ways, the course of acts have been crafted in such a way to try and separate the southern and middle colonies from the New England colonies. A British official urging slaves to run away and take up arms against their masters is not a way to prove the Southerners that the British Empire has their best interest at heart. Far be it. This is going to help spur the southern colonies to the side of the New Englanders. Not that they needed much of a spur. In fact, if you look at it, the middle and southern colonies have always been on board. The powder keg might be New England. That might be where the fuse was inserted. That might be where the match that lights that fuse was lit. But the southern colonies and the middle colonies have been on board from the very beginning, and they had proven that through the committees of correspondence and the work of the Sons of Liberty. They had proven that in the First Continental Congress, and they're certainly proving it now in the Second Continental Congress. And so, although neither side truly wants war, war is upon them, and events have a mind of their own. They've sort of taken over, and men are reacting rather than governing events, at least at this stage of things. And so the Second Continental Congress is going to have to wage war. If Britain is not ready to talk peace, then the colonies certainly can't be ready to talk peace. Neither side wants to negotiate from a position of weakness. And so the Second Continental Congress takes the measures necessary to create an army, to create a navy, to create a Marine Corps. It appoints George Washington of Virginia to be commander of this new Continental Army. And that seems to be a logical and obvious choice, but it turns out to be an enlightened choice because Washington is going to turn out to be the critical man in the story of the American Revolution. And it's going to take him some time, of course, to gather things together and get ready to take command of the army that is besieging the British in Boston. And while all of this is taking place, the war is expanding. It's expanding. And one of the first places it expands into is New York, where the Second Continental Congress directs a officer from Connecticut named Benedict Arnold to travel to New Hampshire to recruit troops for an attack on our old friend Fort Ticonderoga at the southern end of Lake Champlain. Now, that fort was a critical bastion, big stone fortification on the European model, a critical bastion for controlling the water route between Montreal and the Hudson River and New York City. If the colonies wanted to invade Canada, they would have to have Fort Ticonderoga. If the British wanted to invade from Canada, they would have to have Fort Ticonderoga. And so strategically, Fort Ticonderoga is a very important spot. But of course, it had once been on the frontier between New France and New England. And with a British victory in the French and Indian War, Fort Ticonderoga no longer can lay claim to that title. Now it's become an arsenal. It's the place where the British have stowed away a large amount of munitions, artillery, and ammunition left over from the French and Indian War. And that makes it a very valuable target because what the Americans lack is heavy artillery, and they lack gunpowder, desperately short on gunpowder. The army besieging the British in Boston maybe has enough gunpowder for 10 rounds a man, which if there is a serious fight, will not be nearly enough. And so Arnold is sent to New Hampshire to recruit troops to attack Fort Ticonderoga. When he gets there, he finds out that a local leader, Ethan Allen, has already done that. He's formed a militia known as the Green Mountain Boys, and they're preparing an attack on Fort Ticonderoga. Although Arnold and Allen sort of strike sparks initially about who should be in charge, they finally agree to work together. They march on Fort Ticonderoga, which only has a small garrison, less than 100 men. They slip up on the fort During the night of May 10th of 1775, they get inside of it without firing a shot. They capture its entire garrison, basically sleeping in their beds. So this is a bloodless victory, but a very important one, because with this, the Americans seize 183 cannon and 52 tons of ammunition. And most of the artillery the Americans are going to have for the first half of the war at least is going to come from this important, although small, victory won by Arnold and Allen. These cans and that ammunition are still up at the southern end of Lake Champlain. They're hundreds of miles away from Boston, it is true, but it's there. So the war is beginning to expand. At sea, some American privateers have begun to disrupt British supply lines across the Atlantic Ocean. One of those captures a British munition ship that has gunpowder, that has muskets and bayonets. This is a windfall for the Continental Army that Washington has still not taken command of. And there's an army that is going to have its next big battle without Washington at its head. And this is the battle that is known as Bunker Hill. Although more correctly, it was mainly fought on something called Breed's Hill. And basically what happens, and again, I refer you to the maps I'm sending along here with the links to the lectures, is remember that Boston sits on a peninsula of land, and it's on low ground. And so you have high ground to the southeast of Boston, known as Dorchester Heights. And then you have high ground to the northwest of Boston, called the Charlestown Peninsula. And if the Americans ever got artillery up on this high ground, they would be able to look down on Boston, hit anything in the city, and given the limitations of 18th century artillery, the British would not be able to effectively counter that bombardment from inside Boston. General Gage, of course, was not ignorant of this military topography. He understood it all too well, and he planned an amphibious assault that would land his troops at Dorchester Heights, at which point they could sweep around and hit the American army besieging Boston in the flank, and basically bring it to battle on disadvantageous terms, on terms dictated by the British. And so here now is Britain's second strategy to deal with the American Revolution. Remember, the first strategy was to stop it really before it starts, and that produced the movement at Lexington and Concord, and naturally we know that backfired on the British. It started a war instead of prevented a war. So now the British have a second strategy, and that strategy is to win the war in one big battle. After all, Lexington and Concord was kind of a surprise. The British were not able to bring their full force to bear. The tactical circumstances worked against the British. So it appears that they had lost. They had been forced to retreat. They had left the field of battle in the hands of the enemy. They had suffered more casualties. All the traditional measures of who wins and who loses a battle in the 18th or the 19th century. But this next fight, the British will plan. They will fight it where they want to fight it, when they want to fight it, and they will fight it in such a way that their advantages in skilled manpower and munitions and artillery can all be brought to bear. And what the British are hoping here is that they will, of course, win that battle. Why wouldn't they win that battle? The British still tend to look upon the Americans as an ill-disciplined, irregular mob, although the British officers who fought the Americans at Lexington and Concord warn that that's not the case. Lord Percy, who led the relief column that went out and saved Colonel Smith on April 19th of 1775, wrote that whoever looks upon them, meaning the Americans, whoever looks upon them as an irregular mob will find himself much mistaken, unquote. A lot of these American soldiers had fought in the French and Indian War, and although they do lack discipline, they don't have uniforms, their officers have a lot to learn, they are not utter and complete amateurs. And remember that a lot of the British soldiers serving in the ranks are young men who had not fought in the French and Indian War. And so both sides are kind of, green. But the British are clearly the better equipped, better disciplined, and by and large, the better led army. And so they ought to win this battle. And they intend to win it so decisively that it will collapse American morale. See, the British are going to go through the entire war convinced that the American people are not really behind the revolution, that the majority of the American people are loyal to the king, that they've been duped, they've been deluded, they've been tricked, or they've been coerced into this war. And if the British can ever convince the Americans to return their loyalty to the king, if they can convince the American revolutionaries that they've embarked upon a fool's errand, that there's no way these 13 colonies, lacking industry and true political unity, vastly outnumbered and outgunned, can stand up to the might of the British Empire, then the American people will throw down their arms, overthrow their rebel leaders, turn them into the crown, and revert to their loyal status under George III. This is, for the British, a delusion. So the Americans have this delusion that the king doesn't know what's going on, and the king will ultimately step in and make things right. The British have this delusion that the Americans aren't serious. They don't really mean it. It is not completely foolish delusion. At least a third of the colonies is loyal, what are called Tories. In fact, no less a person than John Adams estimated that never more than a third of the colonial population was actively engaged, actively in support of the revolution at any given moment, and that another third were loyalists and the remaining third were neutrals. They were people who were trying to stay out of the way, people who were hedging their bets, people who were sitting on the fence waiting to see which side might win and lose before they chose where to jump down. And so the sense that the British are hoping that there's enough loyalist sentiment to undermine the revolution from within, if it can just be given enough encouragement from the British militarily, that's not completely crazy. But it is misguided, because the third of the American population that is in favor of the war is the most important third. It is the third that's in control of the political institutions of the American colonies. It's the third that's willing to go out and fight, and a third of 2 million people is a very serious obstacle. But nonetheless, this is the British strategy. We're going to win it in one big battle, and Gage has his plan. He's going to sweep down on Dorchester Heights, hit the American army in the flank, drive it away from Boston, defeat it, destroy it, humiliate it, and convince the Americans, wow, we better quit while we still can, throw down our arms, turn in our leaders, and beg the king's forgiveness. The Americans, of course, are aware that the British could try something like this, and they decide to beat the British to the punch, not by occupying Dorchester Heights, but by occupying the Charlestown Peninsula. So on the night of June 16th, 17th, 1775, American troops marched down onto the Charlestown Peninsula. They're supposed to occupy high ground close to where the neck of the peninsula meets the mainland at a place called Bunker Heights. But for some reason, their officers take them down into the middle of the peninsula to occupy slightly higher ground on Breed's Hill. And the Americans have taken shovels with them, and they intend to build a fort in which they could plant artillery. And so the Americans just line everybody up. They start digging. As they dig down, they throw the earth up in front of them. And by dawn, the Americans have a fort sitting there on Breed's Hill. And although the British picked up some indication during the evening that something was going on, they couldn't be sure what it was. And when they woke up on the morning of June 17, 1775, and they looked north toward the Charlestown Peninsula, what had been vacant countryside the evening before now had crowning one of its hills an American fortification. And General Gage understood just how dangerous this was, because if the Americans put guns there, they could shell the British out of Boston. So General Gage decided to forego his plan to attack Dorchester Heights, a mistake on his part, because the Americans, of course, don't have that artillery yet. All the artillery they have has only recently been captured at Fort Ticonderoga, and it's still very, very far away, and no plans are being made to get that artillery to Boston, at least not yet. Nonetheless, General Gage decides that here is an affront to the British position in Boston. This fort is too dangerous to ignore. After all, he doesn't know that the Americans have no artillery. And so he decides to instead attack the Americans on the Charlestown Peninsula, and this produces the Battle of Bunker or Breed's Hill. The British send over by boat ultimately about 2,200 men under the command of General William Howe. General Howe is a very competent soldier, and he looks at the American fort on Breed's Hill, and he decides that he'll stage a diversion there. So the fort's here. He's going to stage a diversion. He's going to send most of his troops to outflank the fort and cut its defenders off by taking control of the peninsula to their north. And so his grenadiers are going to march across the open fields to the north. He's going to send his light infantry down the beach. There's a rocky cliff, so the beach is sort of here and a cliff, so his light infantry is going to come here and his grenadiers are going to go there. It's a good plan, but it doesn't work. The Americans realize what the British are going to attempt to do. American troops under William Stark arrive to reinforce those troops under Israel Putnam and Walter Prescott, who are holding the fort on Breed's Hill. The Americans build some additional little earthworks to sort of reinforce their fort on Breed's Hill. And when the British launch their attack, it is beaten back with devastating losses. The troops advancing along the narrow beach run into American riflemen who are protected by a stone breastwork that they built between the cliff and the water's edge. And the British there are just shot to pieces, almost wiped out. The grenadiers advancing across the open field run into Stark's men, who are sheltered behind a fence, a wooden fence, and they're stalled and shot to pieces. And the attack on the fort on Breed's Hill is also beaten back. The British attempt a second assault. That too is driven back. At that point, reinforcements are brought over under the command of General Henry Clinton. At this point, General Gage decides to change his tactics. Now he's going to launch a full General Howe decides to change his tactics. He's going to launch a full-bore attack on the fort at Breed's Hill, and this one succeeds largely because the Americans are running out of ammunition. So as long as the Americans had ammunition, they were beating the British back, and much to the surprise of the British, the Americans had exhibited outstanding fire discipline. They had held their fire until the British were well within killing range of their muskets, and then had unleashed devastating volleys that staggered the British battle lines, shot down officers, musicians, color bearers, and therefore made it very hard for the British to issue orders or to control their troops. But now the Americans are running out of ammo, so the British are able to get close to the fort and get in it. The Americans exit as the British come in. There's a flurry of hand-to-hand combat, during which one of the more important American militia or political leaders in Massachusetts, also a general in the American militia, Joseph Warren, is regrettably killed, and the Americans are forced to retreat. The British begin a pursuit, but at the last minute, U.S. forces arrive to reinforce the situation. They take position on Bunker Hill and cover the retreat of their comrades from the peninsula. To the surprise of the British, these American reinforcements don't catch the infection of defeat and flee on their own. They stand and they fight. And so the battle comes to an end. And tactically speaking, this battle, Breed's Hill, if we want to be accurate, Bunker Hill, if we're referring to the way it goes down in the history books, this battle is a British victory. The British wanted the Charlestown Peninsula, they got it. They wanted that fort on Breed's Hill, they got it. But in every other respect, this battle is a disaster for the British because, first off, if the British had hoped that this battle would destroy American morale, convince the Americans they can't stand up to the British Army, that they had better throw down their arms and beg the King's forgiveness while they still can, and hope for mercy, Breed's Hill has done the exact opposite. The Americans had twice stopped everything the British could throw at them. They'd shot the redcoats down in horrific numbers, and the Americans were convinced that they would have held the fort indefinitely if they had just not run out of ammunition. And so the Americans, far from being discouraged by defeat at Breed's Hill, are encouraged by it. We can stand up to the British regulars. And that is more than proven in the casualty statistics. So during the fighting on the Charlestown Peninsula, during the Battle of Breeds or Bunker Hill if you prefer, 141 Americans have been killed and 271 wounded. This is about 3 times the casualties the Americans suffered at Lexington and Concord. For the British, it's far, far worse. 226 dead, 900 wounded, including a large percentage of the British officers. And that means that of the 2,200 men that General Howe and General Clinton had to throw into the fight on Breeds Hill, slightly more than half have become casualties. A 50% casualty rate is appalling. Not just from a human perspective, but from a military perspective. It breaks the offensive power of General Gage's army in Boston. It can no longer do anything about Dorchester Heights unless it is reinforced. The British have to hold what they've taken, so they've got to spread their troops out even more so they don't have the reserves necessary to attack. But more fundamental than that, the Americans have proven that they would stand and that they would fight and that they would fight well. So that's somewhat discouraging to the Redcoats. Well, it's of course encouraging to the Americans. But what have the British won for those casualties? They've won some American countryside. They've won a single hill on the edge of a vast continent. And how many battles can you fight where you lose 50% of your troops before you have no troops left to fight any battles whatsoever? And the answer, of course, is not many. It takes a long time to properly train a British soldier. Britain's army is good. Probably not the best army in the world. That title would most likely go to the Prussians, but it's among the best armies in the world. But it's a small army. Remember, England is an island nation, and it has worldwide commitments. And so it can't send all of its troops, or even most of its troops, to America. And therefore, when the British lose men in substantial numbers, they must lose them for important purposes. They must gain something strategic in exchange for the lives lost. And this is not what happened at Breeds Hill. So the British have not gained much of anything. They've potentially forestalled American guns on the Charlestown Peninsula, shelling them out of Boston, but it's an effort that's cost them their offensive against Dorchester Heights, so that high ground is still sitting there naked for the Americans to occupy and use at some future point if they are able or if they have a mind to, and the British are still trapped inside of Boston, where as the winter is going to wear on, they're going to have an increasingly difficult time finding fuel and food, and they're in for a very, very rough siege going forward. And in the aftermath of this fight at Breeds Hill, on July 3rd of 1775, George Washington officially takes command of what is now called the Continental Army. And if you believed in omens, that date was not an especially auspicious one because it marks the 25th anniversary of his surrender of Fort Necessity at the start of the French and Indian War. That turns out not to be prophetic, which is good for the Americans, but Washington is appalled by what he finds in New England. There is poor discipline, there is poor sanitation, which leads to sickness. Men kind of come and go as they wish. There is a gross shortage of ammunition. Washington is really going to have to build an army from scratch, discipline it from scratch. He's not especially impressed with the New Englanders when he first meets them, being a Southerner, but he's going to get over that. He's also initially appalled that there are black troops serving in New England regiments, and being a Southerner, he has an instinctive fear of black men with weapons in their hands. He's going to get over that too. And for the cause of America's future, he is willing to accept anybody who's eager to fight. And these black troops, especially from colonies like Connecticut, are going to turn out to be very good, very loyal soldiers. And he's going to come to depend on them as much as any other troops in the Continental Army. Some of them are free blacks fighting in the American cause. Others are slaves who are fighting on the promise of gaining their freedom. once the war is won if they have given loyal service, which of course both things are going to happen. So the Continental Army is a biracial army, and it's not even a strictly segregated army in many regiments. And so Washington has got his work cut out for him. It's going to take iron determination, it's going to take tact, it's going to take skill, it's going to take intelligence. Unfortunately, in Washington, you find all of these attributes. And Washington, though, is impatient. He wants to strike a blow. He wants to find a way to attack the British in Boston. This is a daunting circumstance because of the geography of Boston. You either have to attack up the narrow peninsula of land into the teeth of British fortifications, to launch an amphibious assault across the bay in the teeth of British fortifications of the British Navy. Washington concocts several schemes, including waiting until winter and Boston Harbor freezes over, and then he'll send his infantry to attack across the ice. But it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen, one, because his officers caution against it, and he heeds their advice, and also because he doesn't have the ammunition to do it. But nonetheless, Washington is determined to drive the British out of Boston, and in that sense, he understands the high ground at Dorchester Heights is key. If he could get artillery on that high ground, General Gage would have no choice but to evacuate, and the artillery that he needs is up at Fort Ticonderoga. And so Washington sends a fellow named Henry Knox, one of his officers, a colonel in the Continental Army, to get those guns and bring them back. Knox had been a bookseller in Boston previous to the Revolutionary War. He was an ardent patriot, somewhat rotund fellow, but Knox was a man who had a keen interest in military things, and he had read anything pertaining to the military that he could find, and had bought books in his gift shop that were military treatises, and he'd read manuals, and so he was something of an expert on artillery. And so he was sent to Fort Ticonderoga with a detail of men to bring back cannon and ammunition. And they went in early 1776 in the dead of winter. They used sleds pulled by oxen to drag the 52 cannon and their attendant implements and enough ammunition for them through the wilderness of upstate New York, crossing several rivers. An incredibly difficult mission, but Knox handled it. In early March of 1776, he gets those guns to Boston, and for this accomplishment, he's going to be made commander of the Continental Artillery. Eventually, he's going to be the first Secretary of War in Washington's presidency. Knox is going to prove that he deserves these rewards, and he will command the artillery going forward. And what Washington does is he comes up with a very clever scheme to put those guns on Dorchester Heights. It's winter, the ground is frozen, so the troops cannot dig like they did at Breed's Hill. So Washington builds a series of movable fortifications, so wicker baskets called gabions that you can put rocks into, something called chandeliers, which think of hollow wooden boxes that you can carry and then put rocks and dirt into. He takes hay and hay bales with him that can, at least from a distance, look like solid fortifications, and he prepares all of that stuff to move onto Dorchester Heights on one night in early March. He has Knox's artillery begin a bombardment of Boston to cover the noise of the carts and the wagons. They're going to haul all of these prefabbed fortifications and the artillery up to the high ground, and it works brilliantly. And once again, the British go to bed one night. They look to the southeast at Dorchester Heights, empty American countryside. And when they wake up the next morning, they look there, there's an American fort. And this time the American fort has cannon in it, and these cannon begin to shell Boston, and nothing the British try can elevate their gun tubes enough to counter that bombardment. And at this point, the British realize that they they have been bested. General Gage, after Bunker Hill, has been recalled. Howe is now in command of the British troops in Boston, and he understands that his situation is desperate. The Americans can hit anything in the harbor. He is in a bad way for food and fuel, and he sends word to Washington asking for a ceasefire and promising that the Americans will not harass them. The British will board their ships and sail away from Boston. And let the Americans come in, and they will not burn the town as they evacuate. And Washington agrees to that deal. The British have a lot of difficulty getting away. There aren't enough ships. Well, there are enough ships, but there aren't enough sailors to man the ships. And so the British eventually managed to get their army and 1,000 loyalists who had stayed with them during the siege of Boston into vessels, and they sail away for Nova Scotia up there in Canada. And on March 17th, 1776, the Americans march in. They march in, and Washington has won his first campaign. Technically, he hasn't won a battle. It's not really a battle, but he's outfoxed the British, he's outmaneuvered them, he's outthought them, and he has triumphed. He has liberated Boston. And with the retreat of General Howe's army to Nova Scotia, the only really large force of British troops in the 13 colonies is gone. Now, there are still British troops here and there, and forts around the Great Lakes and along the coast, but the main British army is gone. And so this is a huge triumph. Washington has prevailed. It certainly burnishes his reputation. It makes it look like the Second Continental Congress had made a perfect choice. And some people might think that this does it, the war's over, but most people understand, no, this is far from over, and Washington is one of them. He says the British are going to come back. And when they come back, I know exactly where they're going to come to. They're going to come to New York City because they're fighting a war on the other side of the Great Ocean. They're going to need a base from which to operate. That base must be able to accommodate an innumerable number of seagoing vessels. It needs to be centrally located so that they can strike into the New England or the Middle colonies or launch amphibious expeditions into the Southern colonies, and New York City is the perfect spot. And so Washington takes his army to New York City to begin to organize its defense. And while Washington is moving to New York, Howe is in Nova Scotia. The British are preparing massive reinforcements to send to North America. Militarily, we are in a little bit of a lull here, and that gives us a moment to step back and ask a fundamental question. And that question is, now that we are uncertainly beyond the point of negotiations, that this war going forward, who is favored to win it? Who has the advantage in this war that is now blossomed into full-scale conflict? And of course, almost anybody who would have looked at the situation in early 1776 would have given you the same answer, and that answer was the British. The British are certainly going to win because they have almost nothing but advantages, and the Americans have almost nothing but disadvantages. So if we look at the scales, how does this balance out? Well, on the surface, the British certainly have the upper hand. The British are an established nation. They have all the mechanisms of government. They are under a single crown. They have the ability to raise money, to levy taxes. The British have a very good army. They have the world's biggest and best navy. They have the resources of an empire to draw upon. British officers are experienced and well educated. The British population is vastly larger than that of the American colonies. Most of the Indians in America are going to side with the British rather than the colonists. Not all, but most. The British have the support of maybe a third of the population of the 13 colonies who don't like the revolution, who want the British to win. Some of them will volunteer and serve in the British armies. Some of them will be spies. They will certainly be brooding for the British and telling them what they can about the American countryside and where the roads go and where the fords and the rivers are and that sort of thing. The 14th colony, Quebec, is going to remain in British hands. The Americans in 1776 are going to launch an abortive effort to invade Canada and take Montreal and Quebec. This will be done under the command of Robert Montgomery and Benedict Arnold. It's going to come incredibly close to success, but ultimately is going to fail due to lack of men, supplies, bad weather. Montgomery is going to get killed. Arnold is going to get wounded in the leg and captured and held briefly as a prisoner of war before he is exchanged. And so Canada is going to remain in British hands, and it will provide a base from which to operate and help to hem in the Americans. And so if you look at all of that, Britain has control of the seas. Britain can move its men back and across the Atlantic Ocean, send its supplies across the Atlantic Ocean. And you take these British advantages and you add them to American disadvantages. The Americans are only tentatively united politically. The colonies are still inclined not to play nice with each other, especially on political question. They still have their jealousies and are going to carefully guard their prerogatives. The Americans, unlike the British, have no industry. The Americans, unlike the British, have no money. American trade is disrupted because of the war. The American people are divided. America is a vast wilderness. There's no real infrastructure to speak of, and with the British in control of the coast and the seaways, it's going to be very hard for the Americans to move troops and men around quickly and efficiently. The Americans have the Indians against them. They have the Canadians against them. They have no allies to speak of. At the start of the war, they have to build an army from scratch. They have to build a government from scratch. They have to build a Navy and a Marine Corps from scratch. It's going to take some time for them to acquire enough weapons, to get enough ammunition, to feel like they can really contest the issue with some reasonable chance of success. They're taking on the greatest power on the planet, and a power that had fought a war on this very ground and won it against far more formidable enemies just 13 years ago. The British had beaten the French and the Spanish and their Indian allies in the French and Indian War right here in America. They've been over here and they've done it before. So you add British advantages to American disadvantages, and the odds seem to heavily favor England. But it's not quite as simple as that. We have to flip the coin over. The British and the Americans have countervailing things to consider. The Americans have some advantages, and the British have some disadvantages. What are the American advantages? Well, that vast wilderness. It's an encumbrance, but it's also a positive. The American army can fade back into that wilderness, and if it needs to, and the British are going to have a very hard time following. If it's difficult for the Americans to move around the countryside where there's no infrastructure, it's much harder for the British. You have more stuff. They have more wagons, more supplies, more cannon, and so it's harder for them to move around these sparse road networks than it is for the American army. The Americans might be divided, but the third of the people who are in favor of the war are ardently in favor of it. And the neutral people, well, they're not going to be much of a problem. And the third that are in favor of the war, of course, control the political system. And so it's the most important third that's in favor of the Americans. The Americans might not have formal allies, but they have friends. England has enemies, and England's enemies are America's friends. The Spanish and the Dutch, and particularly the French, would like to see nothing better than to have England get its comeuppance in America, to see England beaten and driven out of North America as England had driven them out of North America. And they're going to give encouragement to the Americans. They're going to give clandestine support to the Americans. And if the Americans ever make it look like they might win this thing on their own, they might give money and supplies, and they might even come into the war on the side of the colonies and force England to fight a world war, not just a civil war on the North American continent. The Americans also have the great advantage of a brilliant set of men. who are going to lead the American cause. And it is really remarkable when you look at the leaders of the American Revolution, their not only dedication, but their competence, their skill, the depth of their intellect. And historians are constantly amazed that such a collection of men all happen to come together in the same place at the same time at this particular moment in history to lead the revolutionary cause. You not only do you have people like the iron-willed George Washington and the capable Henry Knox, you've got political leaders like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and John Hancock and these sorts of men. And although they're certainly not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, they're going to make mistakes and they have their arguments and all that, it turns out that it's going to be an exceptional set of people who are at the helm of the American cause, and this is going to make a big difference. So the Americans, who of course are going to get better at fighting and everything as the war goes on, are not without some advantages. And added to these American advantages, we have British disadvantages. The British have an empire to draw resources from, that's true. But they also have an empire to defend. Britain's enemies, the Spanish, the Dutch, and the French are waiting in the wings, looking for the opportunity to pop up and plunge a knife into Britain's back. And so Britain has to keep a wary eye out for them. There's a chance that they'll come into the war, but even if they don't, Britain has to defend its far-flung empire. It can't send all of its ships. It can't send all of its army, or even the bulk of them, to North America. So the empire is both an advantage and it's a disadvantage. The British have control of the Atlantic Ocean. It is true they can send their supplies and their ships laden with troops across that ocean whenever they want. The Americans' Navy is going to be very bold. American privateers and American warships are going to harass the British, give them infinite trouble, but they really can't disrupt that supply line. But that supply line is inefficient. There are storms, for example, and it's very difficult to get animals and livestock across the Atlantic Ocean without a lot of them dying. Communication across that ocean is also still painfully slow. And if that had been a problem politically for England and her colonies before the Revolutionary War, it's a problem for the British militarily. It means that orders sent from England have to be general and vague because the people in England who are giving those orders don't really know what the circumstances will be in America when those orders arrive. When British officers in America report on what's going on in the colonies to London, by the time those reports get to London, the situation in America may change completely. And so coordination of the British military effort across the Atlantic Ocean is going to be difficult. And for the British, the scale of what they're trying to do is enormous. The British will seldom have more than 40,000 troops in America, and that's never going to be enough. And to supplement that, King George III is going to hire mercenaries known as Hessians in a general sense, although technically that's only a certain segment of these troops. German mercenaries. Germany was not a country in the 18th century. It was a geographic region. People said Germany the way we say New England or the Southwest or Appalachia or something like that. Germany was some 300 small principalities, city-states, only a couple of larger countries like Prussia, and a lot of these little countries didn't have much in the way of land or resources, but they did have young men who were enlisted by their prince or their king, drilled to become exceptionally fine military units, and then rented out to fight other people's wars. And so when we say mercenaries, we don't mean what Hollywood makes us think of as mercenaries, the single man, the Arnold Schwarzenegger or Chuck Norris or somebody like that who's, a one-man army all to himself. We mean military units, regiments of infantry, cavalry, batteries of artillery. They'll wear green uniforms, not red. They'll turn out to be exceptionally good soldiers, but the British are going to have to rent them, 10,000 plus more of them, because they don't have enough troops. to do the job in America. And even with the addition of those Hessians, the British job is still way too big. This is a vast continent. Even if we're just talking about the coastline between the Appalachians and the Atlantic Ocean, the British couldn't begin to occupy all of it. And the more of it they occupy, the more of it they have to garrison, which means the field army that can march around and try and fight the American army is going to be smaller and smaller. So the British are only going to control as much of America as they stand on at any given moment. And they have the possibility, of course, of trying to smash the American army. But if they can't do that, how do they overcome? How do they overcome American resistance? The British also have the problem of their mission. And perhaps this is the biggest problem of all that the British have, the mission. Why is England fighting this war? England is fighting this war to keep the American colonies within the British Empire, right? And preferably willingly within the British Empire, because if it's unwilling, then the British have to have a military occupation. You're probably going to have perpetual guerrilla war, which will bleed Britain, not just in terms of manpower, but in terms of prestige, in terms of energy, in terms of treasure, and that will be unsustainable. So the British are waging war, in essence, to convince the Americans to love England again, to love the king again, to willingly remain part of the British Empire. And that is a tall order. That is akin to your parents deciding when you were little that you did not love them enough, that you did not show them enough respect, and they were going to change that by coming into your room every night with a baseball bat and beating you until you reformed and you showed the proper respect and the proper obedience and the proper love. And if your parents came into your room every night with a baseball bat and they beat you routinely, could they ultimately get you to say those words? And the answer is probably yes. If saying those words would make the beating stop, you would say them. But would you believe them? Would you feel them? And the answer, of course, is no. And this is kind of what the British are trying to do. They're waging war to try to convince the Americans, hey, you still want to be part of us. You want to live with us. You want to be loyal to the king. And that presents the very serious possibility of diminishing returns very, very quickly. And so when we add all this up, where does it leave us? Well, it leaves us in almost equilibrium. This war is either side's to win. The British could win this, the Americans could win it. The British have the best chance if they win quickly. And that means win a series of military victories that will dishearten the Americans, destroy their capability to wage war, convince them to throw down their arms before too much death and destruction, too much pain has been inflicted on the Americans. Because the longer the war goes on, the more Americans the British are going to have to kill and maim, the more widows and orphans they're going to have to make, the more destruction they're going to have to sow across the American countryside. And of course, all of that is going to harden American resolve. It's going to make the Americans hate the British more. It's going to make them less willing to want to be part of the empire. It's going to make them want to continue to fight. And so the British need to win the war quickly to have their best chance. Win the war quickly by convincing the Americans to give up, by breaking their morale, breaking their will to fight. Win the war before England's European enemies decide to join the American conflict. Conversely, then, the Americans' best chance is to prolong the war, to drag it out, to frustrate and to bleed England, to encourage England's European enemies to enter the war on the side of the American colonies and make it a bigger war than Britain has any chance of winning. So a long war favors the Americans, a short war favors the British. Not that there aren't dangers in a long war for the Americans, because there's no guarantee that your own morale, your own capability to fight won't collapse before the British will to continue the fight collapses. So we probably give a slight edge to the British here, but really the war could go either way. And while we ponder odds and the two armies regroup and we have something to lull in military operations, the pendulum now swings toward the political, especially in America. So by the time the British are driven out of Boston And Washington begins his redeployment toward New York City. That important point that he believes whoever holds New York City ultimately wins the war. That's how important New York is to Washington. While he's redeploying toward New York City, the question of what America is fighting for comes to the forefront. They've been at war now for a year. There's been fighting at Lexington and Concord. There has been fighting at Breed's Hill, Bunker Hill. There's been fighting on the high seas. There's been fighting at Dorchester Heights. There's been the capture of Ticonderoga. There have been innumerable skirmishes between patriots and loyalists along the coast in the southern colonies. Lord Dunsmore's urged the slaves to flee and rise up against their masters. The British Parliament has issued the Prohibitory Act. In other words, enough water has gone under the bridge for the colonists to realize that they've gotten the attention of George III. And that having gotten the attention of George III, they have not gotten the result of that attention that they desired. They had hoped that the king would say, hey, why are my colonists so angry? Look into it and understand that they've been mistreated by his ministers and set things right. Well, George III hasn't done that. He's doubled down. He's supported his ministers, and so it's clear that the revolution that the Americans were after on April 19, 1775, and for the year that followed, that revolution is not going to happen. Britain is going to continue to prosecute this war, which means the Americans have to continue to fight. But to continue to fight toward what end? If it's not to get the British to recognize and respect and protect the rights of the colonists, as the colonists perceive that they have rights, if that's unlikely to happen, if it now looks like it's impossible that it's going to happen, then why are you continuing to fight? And that means that the question of independence comes up now in public for really the first time. It had been thought about, it had been whispered, but it had never been what the Americans were trying to achieve. But if you can't stay in the British Empire and have your rights respected and protected, then where do you go from there? And the only place you can really go is independence. Independence. If you can't have colonial rights and privileges and liberties recognized, respected, and protected with the British Empire, then maybe you need to create an American system where those same rights, those same liberties, those same properties are going to be protected. And that means independence. But independence is a huge leap. Well, one, if you declare for independence, then you make this a war to the finish. There will be no compromise peace. It will be impossible to reconcile. You are committing America to continue to wage war for as long as anyone can foresee against the mightiest power on the face of the planet. And that seems like a dubious quest at best, one that is apt not to turn out happily for the American colonies. It also means turning your back on England, turning your back on the mother country, abandoning your allegiance to the king and to the parliament, a king and a parliament that has been the only government the American colonists have ever known. A lot of colonists have fought alongside the king's troops against the French and the Spanish. It means turning your back on everything you've known, everything you've believed in, everything you've sworn loyalty to. And that's an exceptionally hard thing to come to grips with. And your intellect might tell you, well, we have no other choice. There's no longer an alternative open to us. But emotionally, to abandon your allegiance is an exceptionally difficult thing to do. And so there was a debate all throughout the spring and into the summer, a debate around dinner tables and firesides, in taverns, meeting halls, in colonial assemblies, and in the Continental Congress about this question of independence. And both sides made their arguments back and forth, but gradually independence began to gain the upper hand. And of course, because it really was the only other alternative. But the man who really helped turn the tide here was a fellow named Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was an Englishman who had been discovered by Benjamin Franklin while he was in London acting as the agent for a number of American colonies before the Parliament. And Franklin, who remember is a brilliant writer and he's a publisher, had found Paine, had been impressed by his work, hired him to come to Philadelphia and write for his papers. And so Paine had been in the colonies for several years, and he had embraced the American cause with the zeal of a convert. Thomas Paine believed that independence was the only logical path for the American colonies, and he decided to jump in to making that argument. He began to write a series of newspaper articles that eventually were collected together in a political pamphlet entitled Common Sense. And this is the way it was done. Printing was expensive. You wanted to make sure that there would be a market for things, so books weren't printed all at once and then sold. They were printed in the chapters in newspapers, and if those were popular, then they were put together as a single book and sold. But political pamphlets were very popular in American colonies. This pamphlet, Common Sense, was exceptionally sold, 120,000 copies in just 3 months, which was phenomenal. It was a bestseller, and for good reason, because in Common Sense, Thomas Paine made the argument for independence, and he made it in plain, straightforward language. There was a brutal simplicity to the case that Thomas Paine made. And in Common Sense, he systematically destroyed the historical and theological justifications of monarchy. He argued that we had to have independence because it did not make sense to live under a king. Kings rule by force, Paine argued, and George III, like all kings, was, quote, nothing more than a royal brute, unquote, who stayed in power because he had armies and navies, jailers and dungeons to keep him in power, who had come to power not by divine right, but because of the accident of birth. He's the king because his daddy before him was the king. And he's not divinely chosen. He's a man like you and I, born of woman. He was a toddler, and then he was a child and a teenager, and he'll grow old and he'll die just like the rest of us. And maybe if he was a good king and a benign king who did the best for his people, then you owed him some allegiance. You owed him some loyalty because he had proven himself worthy. But he has done none of these things. In fact, by his arbitrary behavior, Paine argues, by his use of troops, by his laws, by his taxes, by his acts, by his blockade, he has surrendered any claim that the colonist might have to loyalty for the crown. We owe George III of England nothing, Paine says. But if we owe this particular king nothing, what about England? George III won't be on the throne forever. One day he'll die and there'll be a new king, and maybe that king will be a better king. Don't we owe something to the mother country, loyalty to England? Are we ourselves not English? And Paine argues, no, we're not English, we're Americans. We're a new race of people. And look around, all of Europe is the mother country, not just England. There are people here from Holland. There are people here from the German province. There are people here from Scandinavia. There are people here from the Caribbean and from Spain and from France. And most of us have, in fact, been born here. We have immigrated here. We were born in America to an American reality on an American continent. We owe England nothing. Who we owe is ourselves. And Paine issues this ringing challenge. He says, quote, we have it in our power. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. The birthday of a new world is at hand, unquote. And think about that. Think about how seductive and alluring that idea is. Who among you would not like to start over, knowing everything you know right now? Avoid the embarrassments, the failures, the mistakes, the bad choices, the failed relationships, the harsh words. Couldn't we all do it better the second time around? I think most of us would argue that we could, that we would leap at the opportunity. And isn't that the chance that the American colonists have? We're new people on the edge of a new continent, in a new world. We have escaped Europe's history, Europe's divisions and wars and troubles, and we can erase the blackboard and write on it whatever we want and avoid the old world's mistakes, learn from them to build a better present and a much brighter future. Common sense turned the tide. It really did turn the tide. It was the articulation of what a lot of people were thinking, what a lot of people were arguing, but put into the plainest, most direct, and most simple words. And it swung public opinion decisively in favor of independence. So through the end of June and into early July, the Second Continental Congress debated the question. And there were arguments for and against, but really there was no other realistic option. And finally, on July 2nd of 1776, the Second Continental Congress voted to declare the independence of the 13 colonies. The vote was 12-0. New York's delegation was divided, so it lost its vote, 12-0. And having decided to take that step, the Second Continental Congress thought it prudent to draft an explanation, a declaration that would explain to the people of the colonies, the people of England, the people of the world, why the colonies have done this. The colonies which would now style themselves the United States of America. A committee was appointed to draft a declaration. John Adams was on it, Ben Franklin was on it, and a young idealistic Virginia lawyer, politician, statesman, thinker, philosopher, Thomas Jefferson was on it. They all contributed, but Jefferson was the primary author. John Adams didn't want to be seen as the primary author because he was a controversial figure, somebody that it was easy to dislike, and he said, hey, look, if I'm seen as the author, there'll be people who are opposed to this because I'm the guy who wrote it. And Ben Franklin refused to be the author because he knew that this would go before the Congress, and the Congress would add and subtract, and Franklin made it a rule that he would never write anything that someone else would edit. So it was left to Jefferson to do most of the writing, although the ideas came from everybody. And borrowing heavily on the ideas of the Enlightenment, the political theories of Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau, they put together what we know as the Declaration of Independence. And some people say they kind of plagiarize. No, that's not what they're doing. They're not plagiarizing Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau. What they're doing is taking their political philosophy and giving it practical application in the real world for the first time. The document was brought before the Congress. It was debated. Things were inserted, things that were taken out. One of the things that was taken out was condemnation of England for bringing slavery and perpetuating the slave trade in the 13 colonies. That was a charge made against George III, and the argument was, well, it's not really George III who's responsible for this. That happened a long time ago. It's here, it's a reality. But by the time they were done, they had created one of the most important, one of the most moving, one of the most significant documents in human history. And one of the cool things about studying history is that on occasion we get an opportunity to encounter it on the terms in which it wasn't history at all, but the present. The copy of the Declaration of Independence in the back of your book, you can easily look it up online. So there's no need for you to try and take notes just now. Put down your pen or stop typing and take the opportunity to listen to these words as though you're hearing them for the first time, and perhaps some of you are hearing them for the first time. These words to be encountered at the moment in time when they were fresh, when they were new, when they were true, revolutionary words, as in many ways they still are. And in part, this is what the American colonies have to say in their Declaration of Independence. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind is more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security and safety. And what follows is a long list of charges against George III and England, an indictment, if you will, until we get to the final paragraph. We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, formally publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all the acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance in the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. The words of the Declaration of Independence, some of the most moving, some of the most eloquent, some of the most impactful words, perhaps the most impactful words ever written for mankind. And yet, in July of 1776, they didn't necessarily mean everything that they mean to us today. There was a shorthand here, an understanding of what was going on. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal did not mean precisely that in 1776. It was shorthand for we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all white adult property-holding males who belong to the church are created equal. But that's not what Thomas Jefferson wrote. And that's not what the Declaration of Independence says. He said all men are created equal. And in doing that, intentionally, whether he meant the full ramifications of it to occur in his own lifetime or not, Thomas Jefferson committed the United States of America and its people at the moment of their country's birth to become, in fact, the country in which all men and women of whatever economic background, of whatever race, of whatever creed, of whatever religious affiliation are, in fact, equal before the government and the law. The Declaration of Independence does not say that everybody gets an equal outcome, that everybody even gets an equal chance. Nature does not work that way. What the Declaration of Independence says is that the government and the law will treat everybody equally. Everybody is going to have the equal right to do as best they can, given their talent and their work ethic, their good luck or bad grace. But the government is going to see everybody as the same. The law is going to see everybody as the same. And more than that, the Declaration of Independence is a watershed in human history because for the first time since human beings began to write, the Declaration of Independence says that government occurs by the consent of the governed, that the people govern themselves. Government by the consent of the government is a revolutionary idea in 1776. It has never been tried in modern history at that point in time. Government by the consent of the governed. No hereditary kings, no hereditary aristocracy, no class of men, as one colonist put it, born, booted, and spurred to ride another class of men. That is revolutionary stuff. This is a turning point in the history of the human race. It's a turning point in the history of our country. It's a turning point not just because of what it meant at the time, but because of the obligation that it conferred to the generations that would come after it. And in many ways, all of American history from that moment forward has been about our country becoming the kind of place where all men and women of all races, of all creeds, of all economic backgrounds and political persuasions are in fact fully equal before the government and the law. It was adopted, this declaration, by a vote of 13-0. It was sent out to be read before the Continental Army in New York City and on public squares, in front of courthouses and taverns and meeting halls across the continent. It would be some months before the official document was ready for signature in the Continental Congress. They didn't step in and sign it that day. But when the official thing was done and the time came to sign, the man who was in charge of the Second Continental Congress, had been elected as its leader, was the first to step forward. And of course, there was some hesitation to signing this document. Naturally, there would be, because to sign this document was not only to declare officially that you were a rebel and, as far as England was concerned, a traitor. It was to put a price on your head, potentially a rope around your neck. It was to risk everything that you owned: your family, your reputation, your wealth, your land, your status. To sign this document was to say, I am a traitor. And so there might have been some hesitation, but the president of the Second Continental Congress didn't have any hesitation. He stepped up and he very boldly, in great big letters, put his name right there in the middle, larger than anyone else. And that name was John Hancock. And having stepped aside, or having written his name, he stepped aside. He said, well, I think that that should be large enough for King George to see it all the way over there in England. How interesting that John Hancock had not a political thought in his head until the American Board of Customs Commissioners decided to make an example of him after the British passage of the Townshend Revenue Acts. And what that ultimately led to is him becoming the first man to sign the Declaration of Independence. And if he could sign so bravely and boldly, how could the rest of them not? And they all stepped forward and they signed. And Benjamin Franklin is supposed to have quipped when it was done, well, now we must all hang together, or we will all most assuredly hang separately. But the act has been taken the Declaration of Independence has been signed. Is it a radical departure of the goals of the American colonies? Well, in some ways, yes, because they hadn't started the war seeking independence. They hadn't started the war wanting to create their own country. They had started the war wanting England to recognize colonial rights, to respect those rights and protect those rights. And when that had become evident that it wasn't going to happen, they had created their own country. And that's a fundamental change. It's a fundamental change in what the Americans are fighting for. It means that there's not going to be a compromise peace. This can't be negotiated away. Either England is going to win and keep the colonies against their will, or the Americans are going to win and they're going to have their independence. There's going to be a new country on the face of the planet, a new country built on astounding radical ideas of the rights of man and government by the consent of the governed. But in some other way, the Declaration of Independence is simply a new means to the same old end, right? The colonies are still after protecting and securing the same rights and the same liberties. So you could argue that the Declaration of Independence is simply a new mechanism to get that. You can also argue that it is a fundamentally, radically different goal. In fact, the two things are not mutually exclusive. But the deed has been done. Independence has been declared. And as important and as beautiful and as meaningful as these words are, they will mean nothing if the Americans lose the war. If the Americans lose the war, this document will simply become useful evidence for the trial of rebels and traitors after the British triumph. These words mean nothing unless there is military victory. On July 2nd, 1776, the Second Continental Congress voted to declare American independence. On July 4th of 1776, it adopted the Declaration. On the day in between, July 3rd, the leading vanguard of a massive British fleet carrying 30,000 redcoats and Hessians appeared off the coast of New York City and began landing troops on Staten Island, the island on which today the Statue of Liberty sits. These troops, under the command of General Sir William Howe, have returned to the exact spot in America that Washington had predicted, and it's going to be a massive British force. Washington has put his army in place to contest it, and the politicians, having done what they set out to do, now have to leave everything in the hands of the soldiers, because whether this document turns out to be useful evidence in the trial of traitors, or it becomes the birthday of a new epic in human history and man's attempt to govern himself, is going to rely on the men willing to stand in line of battle, to hold the muskets, to man the cannon, to wield the sabers, and to risk their lives, and in many instances to give their lives, to make this something more than a footnote in history. So independence has been declared, the battle is about to be rejoined, and this time it is going to be a fight to the finish. And so that is where we will end this part of our story. When we get together next time, we'll see how the American cause almost collapses and how it is saved by Washington. And that leaves us with some questions. There are going to be three from this lecture. So question number one, what is the name of the American officer who drug 52 cannon from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston? What is the name of the American officer who led the effort to drag 52 cannon from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston? Question number two, the big battle where the British strategy of winning the war in one great big fight fails? What is the name of the big battle where the British strategy to win the war in one great big battle fails? And question number 3, what is the name of the principal author of the Declaration of Independence? What is the name of the principal author of the Declaration of Independence? So those are your 3 questions, and that is where we are going to leave the story now. When we pick up next time, we will return ourselves to the battlefield, and I will see you then.